to see this. Fantastic. So as we continue talking about navigating white supremacy in the workplace, I thought it'd be really helpful to actually start with definitions. When I first started Hustle Crew and I started doing research on systems of oppression, I read about patriarchy, and that made sense to me because I was like, okay, I can see a world where men are in charge, like men are presidents, men are CEOs. But then I saw white supremacy described as a system of oppression. And I kind of thought, okay, I always thought white supremacy literally meant extremism, right? Like the KKK or other extremist groups. So the idea that white supremacy actually refers to a world where white is the default and white is the dominant really got the cogs turning in my brain. And then I started to think of, okay, well, what does white supremacy look like in my observations at work? And I thought of a couple of examples that I think really bring it to life. So my name is Abadesi. Abadesi is a Yoruba name that my dad made up. And in Nigeria and West Africa, where people are quite familiar with these types of names, it's actually really common. Like people are called Abba in Ghana. Like it's a very, very common name. And what I noticed when I first started working, like I think my first ever job was in the city in London, people often asked if they could call me Abby. And I never understood that because I thought, but Abby and Abba, they're like just a different vowel sound. But people were more familiar with the name Abby, Abigail. It's an English sounding name. It's a white sounding name. Abadesi, I've never met a white person called Abadesi. I'm not familiar with that. And that for me was an example of white supremacy because someone is literally asking if they can call me a different name because it's more familiar to them. And it is quite hurtful, right? Because, you know, you see people showing up with complicated, you know, white names, like Russian names can be more complicated than some Yoruba names. Some Italian names can be even longer with different sounds. French names have different sounds. Abadesi has the same phonetic sounds as in the English language. And yet people asked if they could change my name. So that for me was an example of white supremacy. And then another example of white supremacy, I always used to straighten my hair. I was used to straighten my hair so you couldn't tell I had an afro. I would just wear it long and silky. My mother's from the Philippines, so, you know, I am mixed race and I have different textured hair to like a typical Nigerian person. Anyway, one day I didn't straighten my hair. It takes a really long time to straighten your hair. And also like as soon as it rains, it goes curly again. Anyone who has curly hair in the room will know this. And so I came to work with my natural hair and my line manager sort of went, oh, that's very exotic. You look very exotic. And I just felt so uncomfortable. Like, I don't know if she meant to make me feel uncomfortable, but suddenly everyone was looking at my hair and everyone was talking about my hair. And, you know, without that many other Black people around, it just made me feel like, oh, I'm being reminded that I'm different again and that I'm an outsider. So those are the examples of white supremacy that I have observed at work as a non-white person. So I would love to hear maybe from you first, Georgia, and then you, Matt. You know, how do you define white supremacy and what does that look like in your work?
So I think the words white supremacy feel very heavy. They feel very loaded. And I think they definitely contributed to my fear when having this conversation. It sounds quite scary. It's two words together that make a phrase that I definitely want to distance myself from. And it feels, very loaded. I think, to be honest, I've probably experienced my white privilege in many, many ways that I haven't even realized. And I don't think it's until I've had the experience, like been in the same place as someone else who wasn't white, being treated very differently, that I really got to grips with what the phrase white supremacy really means in everyday life. So the example that I thought of was, I worked at a startup when I was out of uni. It was a grime music YouTube channel called SBTV. And my boss was a guy called Jamal Edwards. He was Black, he was younger than me. And we were going to interview Flo Rida, great musical artist, yeah. And it was like me, we were young, we were all under 25. I was the only girl on the team, and it was me and a couple of guys, and I was the only white person. They wouldn't let us in to the place where we were interviewing Flo Rida because they didn't believe that Jamal was the boss, that this young Black guy, and they only, exactly, rest in peace. So I had to go in and get the Flo Rida's music person to come out and tell the security guard that Jamal was all right to come in. And it's just like, wow, what world? Like I was, he was my boss. He set up the whole interview. I don't even think I'd been working there that long, but somehow I was the one that had to, just because, I sound quite well spoken. I look a certain way. So yeah, that was definitely a stark example for me.
Wow, that is crazy. And like roughly what age were you around then? Or like how, like, because that seems quite early on in your career, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I was like 23. So she
Wow.
must have been 20 or something. Yeah. So I guess he was wearing a cap and stuff, but yeah, it was just that really, and I guess up until that point, I hadn't really experienced that, to be totally honest. So that was a big shift in mindset for me.
And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I'm sure there are a lot of challenging emotions related to that story. Also, of course, because Jamal's not with us anymore, but I really appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, how surreal that you're vouching for your boss when you're the junior employee.
Totally. Yeah. It was just, I mean, we were laughing. It was just crazy. And I felt from Jamal's reaction that it had happened before, but for me, it was such a shift in my mindset. And it just shows how privileged I've been up until that point, I guess.
Feel you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Matt, I'd love to come to you. Same question, what does white supremacy mean to you, and what does that look like? How does it manifest in where you work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, going back to what you said before about sort of the collective definition of white supremacy, I hear the word supremacist and I think extremist groups, white nationalist groups, KKK, da 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 da, and that instills in me an immediate fear response. That's not me. I couldn't possibly be a white supremacist. I couldn't possibly, align myself to that. And I think a lot of white people feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable about being associated in that way, or being associated with the connotations of the word supremacist. But I did a little bit more research. I kind of dug a little deeper, and I found a really interesting quote by David Gilborn. It is quite a long quote, so I'll paraphrase. But when he spoke about white supremacy, he didn't really allude just to self-conscious racism, or white supremacist hate groups or anything. He was sort of referring to the political, economic, and cultural system in which white people overwhelmingly control power. So it's less kind of obvious racism, things being thrown at you across the street or physical abuse. It's kind of a little bit more insipid and systemic than that. You're talking about things like microaggressions in work. For example, one example that is quite obvious to me, and my partner is on this panel, or not the panel right now, but he's one of the attendees. He's going to rinse me for this. But one of my most obvious examples for this is Madonna's Vogue. Obviously, worldwide, I would say, if you said to a lot of people, when you hear Vogue, what do you think of? You think of Madonna. Whereas the roots of that really came from the Harlem ballroom scene for Black and Latinx people in the 80s and 90s. And while Madonna's kind of taken that dance craze and sort of put it out into the wilder world and kind of made it famous, while that might have benefited individual people who were, dancers, maybe like Benny Ninja, someone like that, did it actually contribute to, helping that community sort of rise out from being working class, poverty? Not necessarily. It was kind of, commercially, taken from this community and sort of made to fit a system that was more palatable for white people, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so that's sort of the main example that I would see. And actually, thinking about my own experiences of work, obviously, my basis, my background is in acting. It's within the entertainment industry, stage, screen, etc. And I think we see a lot of white supremacy at play. We're seeing a lot of castings on Spotlight now that say, we're looking for BAME people, we're looking for people from the global majority. And I've heard phrases thrown around like, well, she just got that job because she was Black. I've heard phrases like, oh, well, they're just hiring Black people, and that's, disproportionately affecting women because it only seems to be affecting women. And it's very interesting to see all of these kind of little sort of microaggressions or defensive statements kind of being thrown around with regards to how we're trying to be more inclusive within casting. It's very interesting to me because I think, you know, it sort of goes back to the fact that, you know, I have many Black friends who have worked equally as hard and equally have incredible skills to be able to do those parts. So why does it then have to come down to, well, you just got that part because you are Black? Yeah, that's my own personal experience within my workplace.
Thank you so much for sharing. Like, I really appreciate that. And I can't even imagine how challenging it must feel to go through so many auditions and casting calls and get the part, only to then hear whispers that, oh, well, you only got it because you're X or Y or Z. And then have to feel like it's nothing to do with your talent. That must really hurt. And that actually reminds me of a recent experience I had. I can't even remember where I was, but it was a tech dinner, a tech event, and someone said something like, do you think you've only got this far in tech because you're a Black woman? And that blew my mind, because I kind of just thought, like, how often are men asked that? I mean, I guess now, hopefully more, since the Barbie movie. And patriarchy coming into popular culture. But it often feels like if like a white man gets a role, we're like, that makes sense. But if anyone else gets the role, we're like, what did you do to get that? And isn't that in a way another example of what white supremacy looks like? White supremacy looks like always expecting white to be right and white to be best and white to be okay. And white to be the default, actually, to your point, in casting. And then when someone else is cast, we start to think, what did they do? How did they get that? So that's really interesting, because I feel that I have been asked, did you only get this job because of X? And I don't feel that like my husband, who's worked as long as I have, has to question himself like that. Okay, I can see some stuff going off in the chat. Viv, thank you so much for sharing. I want to move us on to our next question. So this question is about why it's so difficult to talk about being white. So this came up in a lot of the registrations. A lot of people said, how can I just start to get comfortable owning my privilege? How can I like take up space, but not take up too much space as a white person? Other people of color have also asked, how do I just get my white manager or my white teammates to get comfortable talking about this and talking about what they can do about it? So I kind of want to understand from your perspectives why you think it is so hard for people, particularly white people, to talk about being white and talk about the world being white supremacist. I know you've already touched on it a bit so far, but like anything else that you think, Georgia, I'd love to start with you, helps us understand, especially me, I'm curious as a person of color, I feel like I talk about race all the time, what makes it really hard for you?
So I was thinking about this going into this chat. I was like, what's my problem? Is it that word supremacy? Why am I feeling so weird about it? I just felt like I didn't have the right tools, or I wasn't equipped to. It wasn't a conversation I really looked forward to having, to be honest. And I was like, okay, why is that? Is it a guilt thing? Is it because I've, benefited in so many ways that I don't even realize from the minute I was born? I grew up in central London and I look white and I speak clearly, whatever. And I don't want to face that. Is it because I just truly do not have an understanding of what it's like not to be white, which you can't blame me for, but because I don't have it, then it kind of contributes to the guilt, and then it contributes to the, oh, I don't want to do this, and then it's just so much easier not to do it. And it's very easy for white people not to have the conversation, very easy, because we don't have to. And so I've never been in this position where I've been challenged and I've had to, so I've never had to face it, and the longer I haven't done it, the harder it becomes, etc. It's a spiral. I think we worry about getting it wrong because we don't understand, because I can't truly understand what it feels like to have a different skin color. I don't want to get it wrong, and then I'm worried that if I say the wrong thing, people are going to point fingers at me and be like, oh, you're this and you're that. And I really don't want to do that, especially in that era of like cancel culture. And I don't want to get caught saying the wrong thing, and sometimes it doesn't feel safe for me to like express my journey of understanding without feeling judged. It feels like someone's just going to jump down my throat.
Totally, yeah.
It also feels like if I talk about it, then I have to explore my own part in it, and that's difficult as well. It's difficult to ask ourselves those questions. I also wonder if there's a blissful ignorance in not understanding. You know, it's easy for me to not do anything and just enjoy the perks of not doing enough, and maybe that's comfortable for me. I think also, to be totally honest, I'm sure a lot of white people like to think we've got to where we are on our merits, you know, like we maybe somewhere inside like believe that we live in a meritocracy, and, you know, I've worked hard and I've got to this place, and it's not because I'm white, it's because I'm, you know, this, that, and the other. But, you know, of course it's not. So I think it's all those factors rolled into one, basically.
Yes, that's a lot.
It's a lot, man. Yeah.
There are a lot of thoughts there.
Yeah.
A lot of really tough thoughts as well. Guilt, I can only imagine, like none of us did anything 100 years ago or 50 years ago. We are living off the benefits of decisions made there or otherwise. So I totally hear you on that. But then at the same time, I very much appreciate the candor, because I also feel that you could just pretend that you're not feeling those things and not thinking about those things. But then I feel that we're not really going to progress and we're not really going to learn. And yes, to Natalie's point, you know, thanks for your honesty. I also love that honesty around second guessing what you've achieved, because that's something that, as a person of color, I also feel all the time, right? I also think like, am I the token? I know this is something that Viv mentioned. Oh, you know, did they just think, oh, let's brown it up in here? Like, I don't know. And, you know, one can spend their whole life asking themselves those things. I think, you know, we're all humans, we're all insecure. We all have those moments of weakness, and it's really hard to look at the evidence or sometimes find the evidence. So I really, really appreciate that honesty. And you know, I'm sure hopefully there'll be people in the audience as well who really resonate with that. And it's certainly given me a new perspective. So I appreciate that. Matt, I'd love to come to you. You know, tell me, like, why do you think it's so hard for you, your peers, people you're around, to talk about being white?
Gosh, like, what more do I say than what George has already said? I mean, look, you know, going back even to that phrase of white supremacy, and we've talked about it already, like how that immediately instills kind of a fear or a defensiveness or a rejection of what the perceived idea of what that is. So I think it's great that we've sort of explored, you know, a shared kind of definition on that today. Yeah, going back to what Georgia said, really getting into that fear zone, and we looked at that little slide earlier, the one about the learning zone champs and the comfort zone, and that's also sometimes referred to as the fear zone. Really keeping yourself there out of fear of not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to be cancelled. And I think that was a great point, Georgia, because I think cancel culture terrifies me at the moment. I just think there's a really huge toxic discourse around a lot of things today, especially online. You know, that scares people. I genuinely feel like it scares people into not wanting to speak honestly or speak openly. And there's certainly a difference between speaking honestly, openly, with curiosity, with empathy, rather than kind of, you know, spouting ignorance in a way that's kind of hate speech almost. I do agree with you as well, Georgia. I think it's easy for white people to sit back on their laurels a little bit, especially, you know, personally for me. Sometimes if I was sort of looking at everything that was going on during Black Lives Matter, and I was like, well, I'm just one person, you know, what can I do? I can't solve the system. I can't, you know, create meaningful change by myself. And then it's easy to sit back and it's easy to do nothing. You know, I can close my laptop today after this discussion and not think about white supremacy ever again if I want to. And that's easy, but that's not necessarily, you know, the best thing to do. That kind of defeats the purpose of sort of what we want to do here. So I think, you know, not being afraid to kind of to be fearful, to push through that comfort zone. I think, you know, we keep ourselves within that fear zone for many, many reasons. You know, we don't want to offend people, we don't want to say the wrong thing, we don't want to admit our ignorance, really. And I think once we admit that we all have ignorance, that's when we can all be a little bit kinder to each other and start, you know, working together to inform ourselves and to work forward, you know.
Yes, I appreciate that. I think that's like so helpful. And I think it's also a reminder about, what kind of world do we want to inhabit in the future, right? Because that's really what it's all about. And what kind of manager do we want to be? What kind of boss do we want to be? What kind of teammate do we want to be? Yeah, Deanne makes a wonderful point. Cancel culture isn't necessarily a new thing, right? Reputational risk is not new. There was always a newspaper, a media, the gossip mill back in the day. There was always a way someone could say, hey, this person's out of line. But I think the point that Deanne is making around how it becomes maybe an excuse or maybe a reason to not be radical, be progressive, be different, take a risk is really, really, really important. And I think that is a question that we always explore in Hustle Crew workshops. I think it's a bit too complex to dive into now, but what are you willing to risk to improve the world for the future generations? What are you willing to risk? Because if we look at history, we can see that people risked their lives. There are women that dared to read or learn to educate themselves only to be later called witches. And we see that. And I'm not saying I would risk my life. Like I'm risking my work life. I'm risking my career and in a bid to make change. But I think all of us in our own small little ways, as a manager, as a parent, as an aunt, as an uncle, as a counselor, we have people in our lives who don't necessarily share the same privileges as us. And when we think about what we can do to help them, to your point, I think we have to decide, what are we willing to risk? And sometimes we are willing to risk our reputation in the eyes of others because we don't respect their views as much as we respect the people that we love. So I really appreciate everything that's being said. And I just wanted to add that. What are you willing to risk? Like, what are you willing to lose? And I lost my comfort a long time ago, okay? When I decided to start a business all about talking about racism, sexism, classism, all the isms, I was just like, well, I've invited discomfort into my life. It's here to stay. But yeah, I really like those reflections. Thank you so much. And I can see the chat blowing up as well. So Luke, thank you so much for sharing. Georgia's point, I haven't had to face it, rings true. I'm straight, white, cisgendered male. I don't have to think about the barriers I don't face day to day. I joined an internal work group on race and ethnicity, and their opening question was, what is your ethnic cultural heritage? And I never had to think about it and articulate it before in that way. So yeah, powerful stuff. Thank you so much for sharing. So the next question I want to ask is a question that we do use often in like Hustle Crew workshops, especially when we're working with senior leadership teams, as a really interesting way to like compare and contrast people's experiences of race. Race as a construct, race as this thing that, like, if you really start to think hard about it, doesn't make sense, yet is so important to how we judge each other and judge ourselves. And, it's such a big, weapon almost, really, right? Like people have used race as a weapon to oppress others and get their own way. And so this question is really, how old were you when you realized, we live in a world where race matters. We live in a world where white race is ruled. What happened? What is the story, and how did that make you feel? And I'm actually going to start us off. So imagine a little Abadesi in the 90s, little toddler. I don't know. It was before I started school, so I guess I was like 4 or something. And I was obsessed with Saturday morning cartoons, like all kids are. And this commercial came on for a doll. And this was a doll that you could put makeup on. And I was blown away because I loved watching my older sister get ready. I loved watching my mom get ready. I wasn't allowed makeup, obviously, but I was like, now I have a doll. I can put makeup on. I'm going to get this doll. This is going to make my life amazing. And anyway, my dad took me to Toys R Us. And, as I mentioned earlier, my dad's from Nigeria. My mom's from the Philippines. My parents were different colors. I wasn't really thinking about race. I was just like, whatever, like life. Anyway, we go to Toys R Us and I knew exactly where to go. I'd go to the doll aisle. I find the doll and I take this doll off the shelf and I'm like, I'm getting this doll. And my dad's just like, you can't get that one. You have to get that one. And he points to the brown version of the doll. And I was like, I don't want that one. I want the one from the commercial, which is the white doll. And he's like, no, you have to get the doll that looks like you. And I was just like, what? Okay, but I want to look like the one in the commercial. Like, in my child brain, I already knew that the one in the commercial was better because it was in the commercial. This brown one, which is not even in the commercial, I look like that. I don't want to look like that. I want to look like the one that's on TV. And what really broke my heart was not just the fact that I then realized in that moment, I suck, was that I then took the doll back home, opened up the makeup kit, and they used this same makeup kit for the black doll as the white doll. So none of the colors worked. The pale pink blush didn't show up on her brown plastic, like the light blue, all the colors didn't work. And I was so frustrated and I was so angry because I was like, I just wanted the doll from the TV. And now I've got the crappier version and it's not even nice. It doesn't even work. So I was so young when I already then started to realize the good camp, the worst camp, or the right or the wrong, or what's on TV and what's not, what works, what doesn't. And that's been plaguing me since then. And maybe it's no surprise I ended up doing this work. But yeah, I would love to hear from you, Georgia. When did you realize we live in a world where race matters?
Yeah, it's interesting because I obviously don't have that experience of like watching Disney films and not identifying with the character, having dolls that didn't look like me. I didn't have anything like that. And it's interesting when you say about your husband, when you asked him, oh, when did you realize that you were white? And he said, oh, I hadn't really thought about it. I don't think I was as stark as that, but honestly, I wasn't far off. Again, to bring it back to the Jamal thing, when I realized when I was taken as the boss, as the white woman, but he was actually my boss. It was just in contrast to other people. It was like noticing a friend of mine not getting treated the same. Again, I'm not saying I can understand what that feels like just because I have mates from different places. There's like the old adage goes, but that was just when something in my young brain was like, oh, so like I had a family move in the flats above me from Kenya, has a single mom, and one of the daughters used to babysit me all the time. So I'd go on her missions for her family. She'd have to go out and get food and la. And that's when I realized there was different places where I wouldn't have hung out before. There was different shops for hair products. There was different butchers for different people. And I was like, oh, and at school as well, I think in the 90s, there was a lot of words flying around the playground. I don't even know if I want to say them, that I didn't get called, but other people would. So it's more that kind of stuff, like the labels and the places being different for different people that really made me realize that whiteness mattered.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love how your experience of it was actually like quite physical, like going into spaces. You're like, I haven't been to this grocery shop before. Like, what's happening here?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. Just being reminded that we can all occupy the same city, but we're actually living in the city in very different ways. And I really, really liked your reminder of that. And then also, yeah, the playground. I think a lot of us, I mean, my childhood, I didn't really have my own opinions. I just parroted what I heard or what I thought was cool. And unfortunately, sometimes people are parroting quite cruel stuff. And so, yeah, I appreciate the honesty there. Thank you. Matt, I'd love to hear from you. How old were you when you realized race is a thing, race matters? What happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So, very
Sorry, I was trying to make you spotlight and I muted you. That's really bad directing.
all
This is
good, all
why.
good. No, I was just saying, so, very similar to Georgia, I never looked at books, I never looked at TV without seeing someone who looked like me. It was never something that, I had to think about. I grew up in rural Northern Ireland. So as you can imagine, that was very, very white. There really was not many people from the global majority at all. But one story that sticks out in my brain, and I feel so uncomfortable every time I tell it, but I feel like it's useful. So I distinctly remember being around about 6 years old, in my kitchen with my mum. It was quite late in the evening, and we had the news on, and I remember the presenter being a black man, maybe of about 50 years old or so, and I remember looking at the screen and I just started laughing, and I started pointing at the screen, and I was like, look, mummy, he's dirty. He's dirty. obviously, you know, my mom turned around and, you know, sort of sat me down and explained everything sort of about race and people of different skin colors and all of that. And honestly, I don't really know how I felt in that moment. Obviously, I'd just been told off, so I was a little bit sad. But, you know, I think what was most interesting to me looking back on that story now is what information had I had before then to make me think that this particular person was dirty, less than, outside the normal, you know, should be ostracized. I don't know if that even goes down as far as, you know, like actually looking at colors, like brown is like the color of dirt, you know, black was considered evil. You know, even little sort of micro things like that you grow up with as a child, you know, that maybe just connected dots in my young brain to sort of say, oh, well, that person's dark, so that person is bad, they're dirty, they're wrong. So that was interesting. And like I say, I actually hate telling that story. It makes me feel really uncomfortable now.
Honesty. Thank you.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's interesting for me to think about, actually. So yeah, that would be my first experience.
Thanks for sharing that. And one of the things that we were speaking on before we started, because I know how difficult it is when one's experience, you know, Georgia was born and raised in London, super cosmopolitan city. You were born and raised in like a rural part of Ireland, as you mentioned, Northern Ireland. There probably weren't actually that many people who were not white around you. And I guess I wanted to kind of like just dive into that a bit deeper and talk a little bit about like confronting our privilege, even when we haven't necessarily felt very privileged. I remember watching movies like Angela's Ashes, for example, and like being reminded of the poverty that many working class families experienced in Ireland. There are working class families in London, the city I'm in right now, who probably will be getting their dinners from a food bank tonight. And, you know, this is the stark, harrowing reality of capitalism as we know it. But one of the things we were talking on, because this was a question submitted, was this idea of class being a defense mechanism to race and racism in particular. So this idea of like, well, I can't be racist, or I can't have benefited from white privilege because actually I'm working class or I'm poor. I don't know what you think about that, Matt, because you probably had such a diversity of socioeconomic classes growing up in rural Northern Ireland. Like, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And this is something I've actually had quite a lot of conversations about, especially, you know, with my close friends and family. You know, and it was a very interesting question whenever I read it, that was sort of sent ahead of this. So it's, you know, does the idea of like white skinned Irish people and white working class people, do they use their previous, you know, heritage or ancestors to sort of absolve any feelings of racism? And I think that's a really interesting one, because, you know, a lot of what I hear and have heard in the past, you know, it's a fact that, you know, white people during the 17th century were taken to Jamaica as slaves as well. I often quote Charles Kingsley, who famously wrote The Water Babies. And in 1860, he wrote on an excursion to Ireland, to see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not feel it so much. So, and we all kind of know no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, right? However, a lot of the discourse that we get now from some Irish people is, oh, well, our ancestors had all of this happen, so, you know, we understand. And they use that kind of as a way to almost deflect away from themselves. I think it's very much a culture of, you know, oh, well, but like we experience this as well, so we're the good white people and you need to worry about the bad white people. And that's very much, I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Abba, that's very much sort of a defensiveness in a way. It's absolving yourself of any responsibility to how you might be contributing to, you know, the systemic issue of racism today. And I think it's a false narrative to sort of say that Irish people, especially, you know, specifically white-skinned Irish people, face the same, you know, well, any racism today, to be honest. So, you know, what I would encourage certain people, and I speak to maybe white-skinned Irish people now, but certainly white working class people as well, is use your ancestry or your history or your knowledge to be an active ally to the people who need your help now. It's kind of not useful to use it as a soundbite to kind of ascribe blame to another section of the white society, because we all have something to contribute towards sort of leveling the playing field for everyone. So that's my thought on that specifically.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I think I can understand that line of thinking to some degree, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend I don't get what's happening when, I've been in situations before as well where I've said, okay, we're here to talk about your latest employee engagement results, and the white employees have very different scores to the Black employees. They don't feel as safe or as included. And why don't we start talking about some of the issues behind that? Let's talk about race, let's talk about privilege. And I've had chief execs say things like, I just refute the idea that I'm privileged because I grew up on a council estate. You don't know anything about me. Like, you're seeing a white guy, cishet white guy, but you don't know. And that is defensiveness. It's very natural, right? He's feeling attacked. He's feeling judged. But what's the context? He's also the leader of a company with hundreds of employees who have said, as distinct population of them, we don't feel we're being listened to. We don't feel like we're being heard. And if the reaction to that data is, I refuse to engage with this idea, or like someone else's version of reality, are you being a leader? Like, just because you haven't seen it or felt it doesn't mean that it's not real and it's not happening. And I think it's really important for us to separate like feelings and emotions, for example, suffering, from, systemic oppression and systemic prejudice and systemic racism. Being a rich, white, cishet man is not going to absolve you from suffering and pain. Like, pain is a part of the human condition. You're not going to avoid it. But if you have empathy as a leader and you have compassion as a leader, you can recognize the fact that sometimes we have to put our feelings to one side, me feeling attacked, me feeling defensive. And I think of that as a CEO. I manage a team. I need to put my feelings to one side to hear the feedback, to like learn what I could be doing better. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to like round that off with that reminder, like a lot of this work is always going to bring up challenging emotions and feelings we'd rather not feel, but asking ourselves, well, why do we care? Why are we showing up? Why are we bothering? And if the answer is, look, there are people on our team who are different and who have different needs, or there are people in our family, in our community, and I want to do better for them or be more aware of how I can show up for them, I think we have to engage in it, as tough as it is. Cool. So I want to bring the conversation, as we are approaching the hour, to actions, practical actions. Now, one of the things we always talk about at Hustle Crew is the fact that one-off actions don't create lasting change. Okay, we all know that person that went to the gym once and is like, where's my six-pack? It doesn't work like that. Wish it did. It's habits, right? Consistency and discipline that really make a mark. And so what I wanted to invite our panelists to do today is really share some everyday habits that you feel can help everyone in the room think more consciously about their race, the privileges that come with that, or the lack of privileges that come with that, and what they can do to immediately start making their workplace, more equitable and more fair. So I wanted to actually start off with a bad habit, because I think another thing we can do is think about habits to avoid. And the bad habit I want to share with all of you is, don't have a lack of curiosity to the goings on of other communities or the experiences of people with different lived experiences. Don't look at, for example, a Netflix show as you're browsing through and see someone in a hijab and go, that's not for me. Like, be curious, be like, actually, when was the last time I watched something with a Muslim protagonist? I'm going to jump into that. I'm going to check that out. So don't lose curiosity. And there are many times I've done Hustle Crew events inside corporate offices, and only women have shown up, or only the brown women have shown up, women of color. And afterwards people said, oh, well, I saw the event art and I just assumed it wasn't for me. And I was like, well, why would you assume it isn't for you. I've spent most of my life reading books written by men, watching movies made by men. I don't assume they're not for me. But as soon as you see a woman leading something or someone different, you don't think it's for you. So, stay curious. Well, what has she got to say? What have they got to say? So yeah, don't lose your curiosity, even when it's someone different, especially when it's someone different from you sharing. That's my habit. Georgia, how about you?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, let me open with a bad habit too, and then I'll say a good habit, I hope. So I think with what you're talking about wanting to compare like class to race, I think it's funny because I think maybe I did that at the beginning of this call. I was like, well, I know what it's like for people to presume that you're rich and middle class when you're not. And I think I felt so like I wanted to do that when I joined Hustle Crew, because I know what I sound like, I know what I seem, and I felt like it's really important to fly this flag. Like, I grew up in social housing and I got a scholarship to private school, and everyone thinks I'm rich, but I'm not. But as a way of defending myself against my lack of understanding and wanting to, I suppose it comes from a good place, because I can't understand what it's like to have different color skin. But by not just listening and being curious, and instead being defensive and being like, well, I understand what it's like to be marginalized too, it's actually really unhelpful, but I understand why people do it. So that would be my bad habit, try not to be defensive, which leads to my good habit, which is being curious. I think I trained as a journalist, I love asking questions. Like, I'm really nosy, I can talk, but I think as humans, sometimes when people tell us they have a problem, we really want to solve it, and we're just really keen to fix it. So I think a good habit to cultivate, and something that I'm just really trying to do more of, is just listen. I don't mean to repeat what you just said, Abadesi, but listen to people and ask more questions. Sometimes a good way of asking questions is just to repeat the last thing that they said. Oh, you felt that that was a hard time for you, was it? And then you kind of lets them open up more. And just being quieter, which doesn't come naturally to me because I love to talk. So yeah, just asking questions, trying to be quiet, and trying to encourage people to share more, because I feel like the more information, the more data you have, which you get by being curious, the more you can empathize and understand.
I like that. I like those suggestions because I feel they're very doable. Listening more is very doable. That saying, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth, la la la. I'm not the person to listen to that, but yes, I really, really like that. Thank you. I'm going to take that on board. Matt, how about you?
Yes, absolutely. So this actually ties in quite nicely to my helpful habit, which is compassionate listening. And the reason that I chose this one is because, going back to what I said at the beginning, what I really wanted to focus on here is, a discussion on how to start the discussion, right? The same way that I felt and Georgia felt probably coming into this panel, what do we say? We're not experts. What do we do? So, what should we do if we don't know what to say? Listen. That's how we learn. That's how we understand each other. And I think that's almost an easy way to take us out of the fear and comfort zone and put us sort of straight into that, learning or growth zone. Just sit and listen. You don't have to actively listen. You don't have to contribute. You don't have to understand. You don't have to, say, well, my lived experience is this, so I totally understand what you mean. Because chances are you probably don't. Listen to the people around you and just ask yourself internal questions. If there is an issue within work, and these are issues that extend across fintech, entertainment, STEM, everything, ask yourselves, is this something you can relate to? Is this something you've ever experienced? If not, why is that? Is it a racially specific problem? Is there a certain privilege you might have that means you haven't faced this type of issue personally, or something you've never had to consider? I know, Luke, you made that really good point, which I actually relate to as well, with regards to I've never had to think about it before walking into a room. If someone asked me what my culture or heritage was, it's not something, we've had to consider. Is there a way that you can use your privilege to lift up your colleagues or implement lasting changes in your workplace? This goes into sort of speaking with your HR manager, looking into your company policies, making sure there's safe spaces, that there's safeguards for people when they do experience these types of issues. And I think, going back to what Abba said as well, that is very important for people within leadership specifically, and line managers, as you are sort of running a team or you're looking after a team, are you going the full mile? And don't stop yourself. because it seems like a big problem, because it seems like a hard problem, because you don't have all the answers. What I would recommend you do is compassionately listen, try and think about whether you've experienced it before, whether this is something that's new for you. You could admit that, and then have a little look at your practices to see if there's anything that you can do to change that or to help.
Amazing. I like that. I also like that reminder that we don't have to have the answers, right? Like if someone calls us out and it's like, oof, you shouldn't say that, or that made me feel a certain way, you're not being asked to go back in time and fix it. You're just being told, what you can do better the next time. And if you're not sure what to say instead, or what phrases could have been better, or what body language could have been better, I think to your point, just ask and then listen, like, wow, okay, what would have been better? Or what should I do next time? And then take note and act on that. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I kind of just wanted to ask more just like a quick fire question, because there are a lot of questions around this. Someone who's a white leader of a mostly white team trying to bring up race with their team, but not sure how to do it. People who are not white on the receiving end of everything from microaggressions to direct quote nonsense to, microaggressions. As white people, what is a way for someone to start talking about potential racism that you potentially were a part of without you getting your back up or feeling attacked, whether that person is white or black? Like, what would be a phrase that someone could use to kind of be like, I want to start talking about white supremacy, I want to start talking about race, I want to start talking about blackness, whatever it is. What is a way that someone could do it where you would actually be like, right, I am going to listen, I am going to be curious, and not, I'm being attacked? Either of you. I can see the cogs whirring.
Yeah.
Next webinar.
Yeah. Look, it's never easy to start the conversation, is it? You might feel a little bit uncomfortable. You might feel a little bit put out, especially with something that you feel like you've actively contributed towards, either intentionally or unintentionally. I think going back to what I said, really setting up those safe spaces for people to be able to talk without judgment. And I'm just looking at your little post there, Sally. I said little, I didn't mean that in a condescending way, Irishisms. I've just had a little look at your comment there. And I know one of the sort of common phrases is, why are you the gatekeeper about race? Or why is it always got to be about race? And these are some of the microaggressions and the comments that kind of make it unhelpful to have these conversations. What I would recommend, and what I feel like has worked for me in the past, is really setting up a safe space to sort of say, let's have this conversation. This is a safe space. You can say what you feel, even with a precursor of, there will be no repercussions to, your advancement, our opinions of you with regards to your professional sort of trajectory with this company will not be affected by this issue. We just want to sort of have the conversation and sort it out, and start talking about these things, start making the workplace healthier for everyone else, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think framing it up makes a ton of sense, and also probably just being willing to get it wrong. I realize that we're nearly out of time, so I just wanted to quickly say a huge thanks to Georgia and Matt for being here, and also thanks to the over 66 people, nearly 70 people that showed up live to participate. I really appreciate it. I know we haven't had a chance to answer everyone's questions, so please follow us on Hustle Crew Live, because we do Q&A every Thursday on social media. We take questions from webinars and get our amazing consultants to answer them. And this recording, along with many other webinars and workshops, are available to watch on hustlecrew.co/academy. So thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Matt. I'm gonna go decompress on everything that I've learned today over a cup of tea. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, see you all soon. Thanks for being here, and do follow Hustle Crew on LinkedIn or whatever social media platform you prefer. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.